Throughout history there have been many executioners who have remained anonymous. We know of Anne Boleyn's executioner that he was summoned from Calais, and that he was referred to as the Sword of Calais. But there were a few executioners who were known for their botching ways, and the fact they performed their bloody task of taking a life poorly. For example, John C. Woods, the executioner who took the lives of those sentenced to death following the Nuremberg trials, was known for the fact he performed his job not up to standard. Many of the Nazi war criminals took dozens of minutes to die, and their death was not instant. There was also an account during the Tudor period of Margaret Pole, the Countess of Shrewsbury, whose execution took up to 11 swings of the axe to take her head clean off, with the inexperienced youth executioner making a mess of the proceedings within the Tower of London. But there is an executioner who has gone down in history for his brutal and barbaric methods, and for almost causing a riot because he was so bad at his job. In fact, his name is even used to reference death or the devil. Join us today as we look at Jack Ketch, history's most brutal executioner. Remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Little is known about Jack Ketch and his life, except for his blunders on the scaffold. However, he first became an executioner in 1663, succeeding London's common hangman, Edward Dunn, who Ketch was his apprentice. He was mentioned 13 years later in court proceedings, and it's believed he was imprisoned for a short period of time inside of Marshalsea Prison. Marshalsea was a prison that had been around at the time for over 300 years, and it was even torched during the Peasants' Revolt as the uprising entered London. It became a debtors' prison as time went on, and the prisoners were separated by class. There was one side for commoners and another for the richer, who were allowed much more luxurious incarcerations, even being able to use a bar and a coffee shop. But in the poorer side, the conditions were brutal, and in the 17th century, one room held 23 women who had no space to lie down and sleep, and because of the harsh conditions, rebellion broke out and the prisoners rose up. Around this time, Ketch was imprisoned, and as an executioner in London, he would have been rather busy. He was mentioned in the Old Bailey's records in January 1676, as in a murder case it was said that the jury brought the defendant in guilty, and Jack Ketch will make him free, meaning that the defendant was sentenced to death for killing, and that Ketch would bring about the sentence, performing the execution. Ketch was also shown in a woodcut depicting the execution of Edward Coleman, who had been implicated in the Popish plot. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered for his treason, and Ketch performed this bloody execution in front of a huge crowd. The woodcut shows Coleman saying, "I am sick of this traitorous disease," and Ketch is stood there holding a rope and an axe, and he says, "Here is your cure, sir." He did write a pamphlet himself called The Man of Destiny's Hard Fortune, and he wrote about his time in prison. However, to become an executioner in London was a rather high-profile position inside of the city. There were a huge number of criminals who throughout the years were executed in places such as Tower Hill, Smithfield and Tyburn. He was being paid, after all, by the state to take the lives of people, and executions were seen as huge forms of public entertainment within different cities. This led to executioners developing a significant degree of notoriety and also intrigue, and because of this, many became known, but some performed their job anonymously. The executioner who performed the killing of King Charles I still hasn't had his identity confirmed centuries later, and performed the king's death under disguise. However, Ketch was paid to do the job, and he did go on strike in the 1680s, as he wanted to get a pay rise, and he did win the dispute, getting a raise. Executioners were not just paid by the state, but families of the condemned would sometimes bribe them, and the condemned would also give them money to perform the office well, and quickly, without any botch. Some people gave jewellery and clothing to the executioner, and they could then sell these on for further profit, and of course the condemned would also hand over a bag of money to the executioner. But many relics could emerge from executed people, and it was said that strands from the hangman's noose of a famous execution could fetch a hefty sum, and these were even carried by gamblers, as they were seen as good luck. But Ketch continued to kill legally inside of London, and in August 1681 he executed Stephen College, who was brutally hanged, drawn and quartered in Oxford. It was said that College had hanged about half an hour, then he was cut down by Ketch and quartered under the gallows, with his entrails being burned in a fire made beside the gallows. There were easier executions for Ketch to perform. For example, a hanging would be more straightforward than a beheading or a drawing and quartering. There was much more that could go wrong with a beheading, for example, and it's in particular for 2 executions that Ketch has gone down in infamy as a brutal botch-making executioner. Ketch was in charge of executing William Russell, Lord Russell, a leading member of the Country Party and a rebel in Parliament following the succession of King James II as the King of England. Russell had been held inside the Tower of London in a cell for a few weeks before he was sentenced to death for treason. His execution took place at Lincoln's Field Inn, which was one of the largest sites in London, and thousands flocked to watch his high-profile execution in a huge public space. But as the public looked on towards the scaffold, Ketch made a terrible mess of the execution of Russell. He was later forced to make an apology for his actions, and wrote the pamphlet, The Apology of Jack Ketch, Esquire, and he claimed he did not dispose himself as the most suitable, and that he was interrupted and disrupted whilst taking aim. Russell was to be beheaded, and his execution was not clean. It was said by onlookers that, on that occasion, Ketch wielded the instrument of death, either with such sadistically nuanced skill, or with such lack of simple dexterity. Nobody could tell which that the victim suffered horrifically, blow after blow, each excruciating, but not itself lethal. Even amongst the bloodthirsty people of society that attended English beheadings, the gory and bloody display had created such anger that Ketch felt forced to write a public apology. Lord Russell's head was not taken off in one clean strike, and it took many for Ketch to take his life, with each blow not killing him until the last, and Russell was left suffering on the block. However, yet again Ketch would botch a high-profile execution, and it was of the Duke of Monmouth's death that would almost incite a riot. On the 15th of July 1685, Monmouth was taken from the Tower of London, where he had been held, to Tower Hill. He was walked by the guards up the short walk to his site of execution, and thousands were there to witness James Scott's execution. It was said, as the Duke approached Ketch on the scaffold, he said, "Here are 6 guineas for you. Do not hack me as you did my Lord Russell. I have heard you struck him 3 or 4 times. My servant will give you some more gold if you do the work well." It's not known if Ketch took this as an insult, bringing up his poor work, but he may have lost focus and his temper. The Duke of Monmouth was then derobed, and he touched the edge of the axe that was in Ketch's hand, and he claimed that the axe was not sharp enough to take his head clean off with one strike. He was reassured that it would, and he then placed his head onto the executioner's block. Ketch then struck the first blow, and it only gave Scott a small wound, and then he struggled on the block as the instinct to escape kicked in. He struck again, and the job still hadn't been done, and then after 2 further blows, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth's head, had not come off. The crowd at this were disgusted and outraged. They were all for witnessing public executions, but demanded that it was performed with some professionalism and decorum, but this wasn't. Seeing James Scott's cut neck, it was claimed he may have tried to give up, and Ketch said, "I cannot do it, my heart has failed me," but then he was forced by the Sheriff of London to finish the job. He told him to take up the axeman and finish, and it took 2 more swings of the axe to kill the Duke, but then his head was still not severed, so Ketch grabbed his butcher's knife to cut through the last sinews. As he held up the head of James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, he noticed that the crowd had become incredibly angry, and the guards were forced to usher him to safety, as it looked like a riot would break out, and the crowd would have killed Jack Ketch. It was said that the crowd was so incensed that had he not been guarded and taken away, they would have torn Ketch to pieces. The Duke of Monmouth's execution was considered too much, and following this Ketch was fired from his job as London's executioner. It was said he was then arrested and was sent to Bridewell Prison, before he was shockingly reinstated as an executioner, and then Ketch even hanged his own trusty assistant, who had been sentenced to death for robbery. However, Jack Ketch today is remembered for being a brutal executioner who did not perform his job well, and 2 executions that went very poorly cemented his legacy in history. It's not known how many people Ketch killed during his time in the job, but it's assumed hundreds and possibly even thousands, as at the time London was a haven for crime. Sadistically, there was even a room inside of Newgate Prison, known as Jack Ketch's kitchen, where the limbs of those condemned were boiled in pots. Today Jack Ketch is remembered for being the executioner who was so bad he almost ended up on the executioner's block himself. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.